A week after I paid off my condo, my sister walked in like she owned it and calmly told me I'd be moving out so her family could take over, as if my life's biggest achievement was suddenly hers to claim. I'm Ethan Carter, 32, single, no kids, working in IT, and for the first time in my life, I thought I finally had something solid under my feet, something no one could take away from me. The condo wasn't big or impressive, just a modest 2-bedroom place in Chicago, but every inch of it carried the weight of years I spent grinding towards stability. I skipped vacations, drove a car older than most interns at my job, learned how to fix things myself instead of paying someone else, and took on side gigs after work delivering food just to shave years off my mortgage. When the bank sent the letter confirming it was fully paid, I stuck it to my fridge with the ridiculous cow-shaped magnet and stood there staring at it longer than I cared to admit. Because, for once, I felt like I had won something in life without anyone handing it to me. So, when Chloe showed up that Tuesday afternoon, I genuinely thought she might be there to congratulate me, which in hindsight feels almost naive considering how things had always been between us. She didn't knock twice or wait for me to say anything. She just stepped inside like the space already belonged to her, her eyes scanning the living room, drifting into the second bedroom, peeking into the bathroom, and even opening the closet I had converted into a tiny office. I watched her walk through my home like she was evaluating it, not visiting, and when she finally stopped in the kitchen, she placed her iced coffee on the counter and said, "This place is bigger than I remember," in a tone that sounded less like admiration and more like confirmation of something she had already decided. I shrugged, unsure where this was going, and said, "Yeah, it's enough for me," but she turned toward me with that familiar look, the one she used whenever she expected things to go her way, and said, "We've agreed this place should belong to the family now." I remember blinking, thinking I must have misheard her, because the sentence didn't make sense in any version of reality I recognized, so I asked her to repeat it, and she did, slower this time, like I was the one struggling to keep up, adding that it didn't make sense for me to keep all this space to myself when she and Daniel had a baby and were struggling with rent, and that they would be moving in while I found somewhere else. She said it so casually, like she was announcing a dinner plan or talking about the weather, and for a second, I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd my brain didn't know how else to react. She didn't laugh back, though, and instead crossed her arms and looked at me like I was the unreasonable one, which was when it hit me that she was completely serious. I asked her if she had already talked to our parents, and she nodded immediately, saying they agreed it was the best solution, that it made sense for the family, and that I didn't need all this space anyway since I was alone. That word alone hung in the air like it was supposed to justify everything she was asking, like my life somehow counted less because I didn't have a spouse or a child. I looked around my condo then, really looked at it, at the mismatched furniture, the slightly crooked dining table I had assembled wrong, the fridge that made a low groaning noise every time it kicked on, and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite anger yet, but something close. Something heavier than confusion. I told her plainly, "This isn't a family asset." "Chloe, I bought it. I paid for it. It's mine." But she waved that off like it was a minor technicality, saying it wasn't fair for me to keep it when they needed it more, and that I could just find a smaller apartment somewhere else since I didn't even use the second bedroom. That was when the disbelief started turning into something sharper, because it wasn't just what she was asking, it was how she was asking it. Like my effort didn't matter, like the years I spent working myself to exhaustion were irrelevant compared to her current situation. I asked her directly if she expected me to just hand over my keys and move out, and she sighed like I was being difficult, saying, "We're not trying to fight, it's just what's best for everyone." And then, almost as an afterthought, she called me selfish. That word landed harder than anything else she had said, because it rewrote the entire story in a way that painted me as the problem, not the person being pushed out of his own home. Before I could even fully respond, she picked up her coffee and casually added that they would need to move in by the end of next month, giving me time to find somewhere else. And then she started heading for the door like the conversation was already settled. I followed her, still trying to process what had just happened, and told her firmly, "You're not moving in here." But she paused with her hand on the doorknob and gave me a small, confident smile, the kind that said she believed I would eventually give in, and repeated that Mom and Dad agreed, as if that alone should override everything else. Then she left, and the door clicked shut behind her, leaving me standing there in the middle of my living room with the hum of the fridge filling the silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at that closed door, feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted just enough to throw everything off balance. And when I finally looked over at the mortgage letter on my fridge, still held up by that stupid cow magnet, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything. Chloe had said she wasn't joking, and neither were my parents. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the thing I had worked hardest to secure was suddenly under threat, not from strangers, but from the very people who were supposed to respect it the most. After Chloe left, I tried to go back to work like nothing had happened, but my mind kept replaying every word she said, especially the part where she called me selfish, like all the years I spent building this life somehow counted against me instead of for me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the latest version of a pattern that had been there my entire life. I've been working since I was 16. Starting at a greasy diner, bussing tables where the tips depended entirely on how generous strangers felt that day, then moving on to shifts at a hardware store during summers, and later juggling part-time jobs through college just to stay afloat. While Chloe, 4 years younger, lived in a completely different reality under the same roof. My parents never said they favored her, but the difference was always there in the details. She got cheer camp, driving lessons, and help with expensive school events. While I was told money was tight whenever I needed something as basic as new brakes for my car, and somehow, if anything went wrong in the house, it always circled back to being my responsibility. While Chloe's mistakes were brushed off as her just having a bad day. It wasn't that Chloe was cruel growing up, she just learned early that things would bend in her direction if she pushed hard enough, and no one really stopped her, not even our parents, who seemed to confuse supporting her with enabling her. When I went to college, I chose a state school because it was what I could afford with scholarships and part-time work, while Chloe got into a private university with a tuition bill that made my stomach drop just hearing it, and our parents didn't hesitate to co-sign her loans, telling me it was an investment in her future, while I was already working early morning warehouse shifts before classes and late nights at the library trying to keep up. She studied communications, posted pictures from parties and trips, and talked about internships at trendy companies, while I learned how to stretch every dollar and say yes to every extra shift, because I didn't have a safety net waiting for me if things went wrong. When I finally bought my condo 5 years ago, it wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I remember the exact feeling of signing those papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, because I knew I couldn't afford to mess it up, not with everything I had poured into getting there. Chloe came by once back then, walked through the place with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "It's cozy," which I knew was her way of saying it was small and unimpressive. And when I told her it was what I could afford, she shrugged and said she could never live somewhere like that, but that she was happy for me. And I carried that comment with me longer than I expected, not because it hurt deeply, but because it showed exactly how she saw my effort as something beneath her standards. Over the years, I kept working, kept improving the place little by little, fixing things myself, upgrading what I could when I had the money, and turning that small condo into something that actually felt like home, while Chloe built her own life, married Daniel, and moved into a much nicer 3-bedroom apartment with amenities I had never even considered affording. Daniel was a decent guy, quiet and polite, the kind of person who avoided conflict whenever possible, and while we were never close, I never had any issue with him either. When they had their baby last year, I showed up with gifts, visited when I could, and tried to be supportive, because despite everything, I never saw myself as someone who wouldn't help family when it mattered. But then the conversation started shifting. Small comments at first about how expensive daycare was, how rent kept going up, how Daniel's hours had been cut at work, and I figured they would do what most people do when money gets tight. They would adjust, maybe downsize, find something more manageable, make changes to fit their situation. Instead, Chloe showed up at my door and decided my home was the solution to her problems, like it was something she could just reassign because it made her life easier. And the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me that my parents had backed her up without even talking to me first. The next morning proved exactly that, because my phone rang before I even finished my coffee, and it was Mother. Her voice calm in that way that usually meant she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like, and she said, "Sweetie, I heard things got a little tense yesterday," and I almost laughed at how lightly she framed it, like Chloe hadn't just tried to claim my home as her own. I told her what actually happened, that Chloe didn't ask, she announced, and Mother responded by saying Chloe probably assumed I would help because that's what family does. And then she repeated the same argument about the extra bedroom sitting unused while Chloe and Daniel were struggling, as if unused space was somehow a moral failing on my part. Before I could even process that call, Father reached out later that day with a similar message but a different tone, more disappointment than persuasion, telling me I needed to look at the bigger picture and step up for the family. And when I pointed out that I wasn't the one asking someone else to give up their home, he dismissed it as me being dramatic, which told me everything I needed to know about where he stood. By the afternoon, even relatives I barely spoke to were texting me, saying things like, "They just need a break," or "You can always find another place later." Like homes were interchangeable and years of effort could be undone and redone at will without consequence. That evening, Chloe sent me a long message outlining her plan, complete with a spreadsheet Daniel had apparently made, showing how much money they would save by moving into my condo, with rent listed as 0 and utilities cut in half, but no mention of maintenance, HOA fees, or anything that actually keeps a place running. And reading it felt less like a request and more like a business proposal that assumed my agreement from the start. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I realized something important in that moment. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated expectation, and if I didn't draw a line now, there wouldn't be one later. By Friday, the calls had turned into a steady pressure that felt less like concern and more like a coordinated effort to wear me down. And when Mother told me we'd be having a family dinner on Sunday to talk things through calmly, I already knew what that meant. Because in our family, calm discussions usually translated to everyone sitting around a table politely explaining why I should give in. I didn't even remember agreeing to it, but I said I'd come anyway. Partly because I wanted to hear them say it all out loud, and partly because I needed to make it clear, face to face, that this wasn't happening. Saturday evening, Chloe texted again, this time with a sharper tone, saying, "We need to be out in 4 weeks. Don't make this harder than it has to be." And I stared at the message for a long time, realizing she wasn't just hoping I'd agree, she was already planning around it, like my refusal wasn't even a real possibility. Sunday afternoon, I drove over to our parents' house, the same place we grew up in, with its familiar peeling wallpaper and that old couch that sagged in the middle. And as soon as I walked in, the smell of garlic bread hit me, almost comforting in a way that felt out of place given what I knew was coming. Chloe and Daniel were already seated at the table when I entered, sitting side by side like they were presenting a case, while Mother and Father hovered nearby with that quiet, expectant energy that told me they had already discussed everything without me. Chloe smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that tries to smooth things over before anything has even been said, and said, "Perfect timing, we're just about to eat," like this was any normal family dinner. The moment I sat down, I could feel the structure of the conversation waiting to unfold, and Chloe didn't waste time easing into it, instead jumping straight in with a softened voice, saying, "We only need the condo for a year," as if adding a timeline made the request more reasonable, and I repeated, "A year," because hearing it out loud made it sound even more absurd than it had in my head. She quickly added that it might be less depending on how fast they got back on their feet, and then slid a folder across the table toward me, saying they had worked out a plan, a budget, everything organized so I could see it made sense. Daniel cleared his throat and added quietly that they would cover utilities, emphasizing it like it was a meaningful contribution, while carefully avoiding the fact that they wouldn't be paying any rent at all. I opened the folder and flipped through the pages, already recognizing the same spreadsheet she had sent me, and as I scanned it, the gaps became even more obvious, with no mention of HOA fees, no allocation for repairs, and utilities estimated in a way that didn't reflect reality. And I looked up at them and asked, "So utilities, that's it?" And Chloe nodded like that was generous, while Mother leaned forward and said, "Honey, it's temporary. Think of the baby. She needs her own room." Which shifted the conversation from logic to emotion, exactly where they wanted it. I looked at Chloe and said, "You're renting a 3-bedroom right now." And she responded immediately, "It's too expensive." Like that alone justified everything. So I said, "Then get a smaller place." And her expression tightened in a way that told me she didn't like that answer at all. She asked why they should uproot their lives when I had space sitting unused, and I held her gaze and said, "Because it's my home." But Father set down his fork and spoke with that measured tone he used when he believed he was being reasonable, saying, "This is about family working together. You have the room, they have the need. It's common sense." And I felt something in me settle, not anger, but clarity. I tapped the folder and said, "You wrote this like I already agreed," and the silence that followed was all the confirmation I needed, because no one had actually asked me anything before deciding what should happen. And Chloe finally said, "We figured you'd be reasonable once you saw the numbers," which wasn't a question. It was an expectation. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward her, saying, "Not happening." And her smile dropped instantly, replaced by frustration as she asked, "Why not?" And when I told her it didn't matter whether I used the second bedroom or not, that it was still my space, she raised her voice slightly and said, "It's just sitting there while we're drowning in bills, and you've got extra space you don't need. It's selfish," repeating that word again like it would eventually make it true. That was when I leaned back and said, "I looked at your lease," and the way she froze told me I had hit something real. And when I added, 3 months rent if you break it early. Right, that's what this is really about. Daniel shifted uncomfortably while Chloe's face flushed, and she snapped that it wasn't my business, but I told her she made it my business the moment she tried to move into my home to avoid paying that penalty. Mother looked between us and asked if that was true, and Chloe deflected, saying they just needed a fresh start. But I didn't let it go, because for the first time, I felt like I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. Daniel tried to step in, saying they were just looking for a solution that worked for everyone, and I asked him directly if it really worked for everyone or just for them. And when he didn't answer, the silence said enough. Chloe turned to Mother for support, asking her to confirm it made sense, and Mother hesitated before repeating that they had a baby to think about. But I cut in and said maybe they should have thought about that before making decisions that put them in this position. And the tension at the table snapped as Chloe slammed her hand down and said, "We're family. Family helps each other." And I replied, "Family also respects each other, and you don't get to decide my home isn't mine anymore because you made bad financial choices." Father tried to calm things down, but I stood up before he could finish, because I knew if I stayed, the conversation would just keep circling until I gave in. And I said, "I'm not doing this," making it clear that this wasn't a negotiation anymore. And when Chloe accused me of choosing to let them struggle instead of helping, I told her they had options. They just didn't like them. And that didn't make it my responsibility to fix their situation. I grabbed my jacket, thanked them for dinner out of habit more than anything else, and walked out while the room fell silent behind me. And as I stepped outside, I realized something important. Not one of them had tried to stop me, because deep down, they knew I was right. They just didn't want to accept it. The messages kept coming after that dinner, a steady stream of guilt wrapped in polite words. Chloe insisting we could still work something out. Mother repeating that family comes first. Father talking about the bigger picture like I was too small-minded to see it. And even distant relatives chiming in as if they had a vote in what I did with my own home. But I stopped responding because I had already said everything that needed to be said. A week passed, and for a moment, things went quiet enough that I almost believed the situation had settled. Until one evening after work, when I noticed something off about my front door. Small scratches near the lock that hadn't been there before, along with a faint scuff mark lower down like someone had tested the door with their foot. I ran my fingers over the marks, and the familiarity I had with every inch of that condo told me immediately this wasn't normal wear. And while it could have been nothing, the timing made it hard to ignore. That night, I locked the door and sat down with my laptop, filing a non-emergency report with the city just to have it documented, keeping it simple and factual. No accusations, just noting possible tampering. And when I was done, I didn't feel paranoid. I felt prepared. The next day, I replaced the deadbolt with a drill-resistant one and installed 2 cameras, one outside facing the hallway and another inside covering the entryway, both set to send alerts directly to my phone. And as I tested them, watching the live feed from different angles, I realized how easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't taken that step. For 2 nights, nothing happened, and I almost started to think I had overreacted. But on the 3rd night, at exactly 2:37 a.m., whoosh, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the alert sharp enough to pull me out of sleep instantly. And when I opened the app, my chest tightened as I saw Chloe standing outside my door, hoodie pulled up, shoulders tense, holding something metallic in her hand as she worked at the lock. For a second, I just stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing, because no matter how bad things had gotten, I hadn't expected this. Not from her, not like this. And then instinct kicked in and I started recording through the app while dialing 911, keeping my voice low as I told the dispatcher someone was trying to break into my condo and that I had video evidence. I stayed on the line, watching as Chloe kept working at the lock, glancing over her shoulder when the hallway lights flicked on automatically, then going right back to it like she thought she still had time. And my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as the dispatcher told me officers were nearby and to stay where I was. Moments later, 2 officers appeared in the camera's frame, moving quickly down the hallway, and Chloe didn't notice them until they were almost on top of her, at which point she froze, her posture collapsing from determination into panic, and I unlocked my door only when they told her to step back, showing them the live feed on my phone with the tool clearly visible in her hand. They asked for her identification, and she stumbled through an explanation about forgetting her keys, but the video made it obvious this wasn't a mistake, and within minutes, they had her in cuffs right there in the hallway, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have in that quiet space. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated watching it happen, just exhausted, like something inside me had finally given out after being pushed too far. And when the officers asked if I wanted to press charges, I said yes without hesitation, because at that point, it wasn't about family anymore. It was about protecting myself. One officer stayed to take my statement while the other led Chloe away, and not long after, Daniel showed up looking disoriented and out of breath, asking what was going on, and I told him plainly. She tried to break in, and he immediately tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, saying she thought she had a spare key, but I cut him off and said I had never given her one, and the video backed that up. He didn't argue after that, just rubbed his face and muttered something about calling a lawyer before following the officers out, leaving the hallway quiet again. The next morning, I made sure everything was documented properly, going to the police station to submit the video files, getting a case number, and storing copies of everything both physically and in the cloud, because I knew how quickly narratives could shift when family got involved. By noon, the calls started again, but this time the tone had changed, Mother asking how I could do this to my sister, as if I had been the one outside her door at 2:37 a.m. with a screwdriver. And when I reminded her of exactly what happened, she insisted I didn't have to involve the police. That family should handle things privately, and I asked her what privately meant in this situation, whether I was supposed to pretend it didn't happen or just let Chloe try again next time. Father called later with a similar argument, saying Chloe had made a mistake and that I shouldn't ruin her life over it. But I told him she had made a choice, not a mistake, and that I wasn't responsible for the consequences of that choice. And when he called me cold for saying that, I ended the call before the conversation could spiral into something worse. The messages from extended family followed, urging me to drop the charges, insisting she didn't mean it, but I ignored them all, because for the first time, I understood that setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no, it was about standing by that no even when it made people uncomfortable. The case moved quickly, and Chloe eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a larger issue, resulting in a short sentence and a permanent mark on her record, something she had managed to avoid years earlier after a minor fraud case that I only learned about later through public records. And while I didn't share that information or use it against her, it added context to everything that had happened. Showing a pattern I had ignored for too long, Daniel sent me a long message while she was serving her sentence, explaining the financial pressure they were under, the stress of bills and childcare, and how Chloe had only been trying to keep a roof over their child's head. But I read it, saved it, and didn't respond, because understanding why something happened didn't mean I had to accept it or excuse it. After Chloe served her sentence, the fallout spread through the family in quieter, more uncomfortable ways than any argument we'd had before. And for once, I wasn't at the center of it. I heard through Mother that Chloe and Daniel had been forced to break their lease, which triggered the 3-month penalty I had mentioned at dinner. And without Chloe working, and with her record now affecting future opportunities, Daniel was carrying everything on a teacher's salary that was already stretched thin. They moved in with our parents temporarily, which turned that familiar house into a pressure cooker of tension. Arguments about money, noise, responsibility, and the constant strain of too many people under one roof. And while I knew all of this was happening, I stayed out of it completely because for the first time in my life, I understood that not every problem in my family was mine to fix. A few weeks later, Father stopped by my condo unannounced, though this time he knocked, holding a small stack of mail that had accidentally been sent to their address. And when I opened the door, I noticed how tired he looked, like the past months had aged him more than he expected. He stepped inside for a moment, glanced around the place like he was seeing it differently now, and said quietly, "Your sister's having a rough time." And I nodded, not out of sympathy or indifference, but because it was simply true. And then I told him, she made her choices, keeping my tone even, not defensive, not aggressive, just final. He hesitated before adding, "She thinks you hate her now." And I shook my head and said, "I don't hate her, but I'm done being the person everyone leans on while calling me selfish." And that seemed to land in a way nothing else had before, because he didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just nodded slowly, handed me the mail, and left without another word. Life settled into a routine after that, and it surprised me how quickly things felt normal again once the noise faded. I went back to focusing on work during the day and small improvements around the condo in the evenings, fixing things I had put off for years, like the sticky window in the living room and the patchy paint in the hallway that I finally covered with a fresh coat. Even if it meant using too much painter's tape and making a mess in the process, there was something satisfying about those small projects, not because they were impressive, but because they were mine to decide, mine to complete, and no one else had a say in them. At some point, Mother mentioned that Chloe wanted to clear the air, and when I heard that, my first instinct was that it would turn into another argument, or worse, another attempt to ask for something under the guise of an apology. So I didn't reach out immediately. Instead, I sent something simple, a framed photo of my front door with the new lock installed, along with a short note that read, "Hope you find a place that's yours for real." And I chose those words carefully, not as an insult, but as a boundary. A reminder that what had happened wasn't just about a disagreement, it was about respect. 2 weeks later, Mother called again, her voice cautious, telling me Chloe wanted to meet and apologize. And I asked a question that mattered more than anything else. Does this apology come with another request? And the silence on the other end gave me my answer. But I agreed to meet anyway under one condition, that my home was completely off the table. No discussions, no surprises. And if that boundary wasn't respected, I would leave immediately. Mother agreed. And the meeting was set at their house, which they called neutral ground. Though it felt anything but neutral when I walked in and saw Chloe already sitting at the table, her posture stiff, her expression guarded, with Daniel beside her looking as uncomfortable as ever. I sat down across from them and told her to go ahead, and she didn't ease into it, instead starting with, "You didn't have to call the cops," her voice sharp, still carrying more accusation than regret. And I looked at her and said, "You tried to break into my home," keeping my tone steady because I wasn't going to let the conversation shift away from that fact. She said she was desperate. Like that explained everything. Like desperation erased accountability. And when I told her she still had a choice, that she could have handled things differently, she brushed it off and said I didn't understand what it was like to have a child and bills piling up, that they needed help. And I told her plainly, you wanted a free house, because that was the truth she kept avoiding. The conversation escalated from there, with Chloe insisting they deserved help and me reminding her that help isn't something you take by force or entitlement. And when she tried to bring up how I didn't have kids and therefore couldn't understand, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest but didn't let it turn into anger. Instead saying, that space you call wasted is something I worked for, something I paid for while you were calling it small and laughing at it years ago. And when she dismissed that as being different, I told her it wasn't different at all. It was just inconvenient for her now. She accused me of ruining her record, and I corrected her without raising my voice, saying, you ruined your record the moment you picked up that screwdriver and showed up at 2:37 a.m., and that seemed to hit harder than anything else, because for a moment, she didn't have a response. Daniel tried to step in, saying it didn't have to go that far, and I told him it went exactly as far as she pushed it. No more, no less. And that I wasn't going to carry the weight of her decisions just to make things easier for everyone else. When Chloe finally said, "One day you'll need help. Don't expect us to be there," I stood up and replied, "Good. That way we're all clear." And the look on her face told me she hadn't expected that answer, because she still believed leverage worked on me the way it always had. I told her I hoped she figured things out, but that my home was off limits forever. No debates, no exceptions. And then I walked out before the conversation could loop back into something pointless, because for once, I didn't need closure from her. I already had it for myself. Weeks turned into months after that conversation, and the distance between me and the rest of the family settled into something steady and predictable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet and firm in a way it had never been before. Mother tried a few more times to organize family dinners, her voice hopeful each time she called, but I gave her the same answer every time, that I would come as long as my home was never brought up again. Not even as a joke, not even in passing, and she agreed, though I could tell she didn't fully like it. Still, she respected it enough not to push further. And that alone felt like a shift, small but meaningful. I kept my life simple, work in the mornings, gym in the evenings. Weekends spent fixing little things around the condo or just sitting in silence, something I had learned to appreciate more than I ever expected. At some point, I heard through a cousin that Chloe had taken a part-time job at a daycare, which made sense given her situation, and that Daniel had started picking up extra tutoring hours after school to make ends meet. And eventually, after a few months, they managed to move into a smaller rental farther from the city. An older place. Not ideal, but theirs. Something they were paying for, maintaining, and responsible for. When I heard that, I didn't feel satisfaction or resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement that they had finally done what they should have done from the beginning. Found a solution within their own means instead of trying to take mine. I didn't reach out to congratulate them or reopen communication, not out of anger, but because I had learned that not every chapter needed revisiting once it was closed. A year passed, and my condo changed in ways that reflected more than just physical upgrades. I repainted every wall, not just the hallway this time, choosing colors that actually made the space feel like home instead of something temporary I had settled for. I replaced the old couch that had followed me since college with one that didn't sink in the middle, bought a used rug that somehow managed to match the curtains, and finally fixed that one floorboard near the bedroom that had creaked every single time I stepped on it for years. Even the small closet I had turned into an office got an upgrade, with a proper shelf replacing the stack of milk crates I had been using, and the plants I placed by the windowsill. Surprisingly, were still alive. Some of them even growing new leaves, which felt like a quiet kind of progress I hadn't expected. But the biggest change wasn't in the furniture or the paint or the small repairs. It was in how the space felt when I walked into it at the end of the day. I would close the door behind me, hear the deadbolt click into place, and feel something settle in my chest, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Not because the place was nicer, but because it was fully, undeniably mine in a way that had been tested and proven. There were no surprise visits, no unannounced demands, no conversations waiting to pull me back into something I didn't want to be part of. The silence wasn't empty, it was steady, grounding. The kind of quiet that lets you sit on your couch with the television off and just exist without feeling like something is about to go wrong. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized the situation was never really about the condo itself. It was about boundaries, about the moment you stop letting other people decide what you owe them simply because you share a history or a last name. For years, I had been the one who adjusted, the one who compromised, the one who gave a little more because it kept the peace. But that peace was always temporary, always built on me giving something up. This time was different because I didn't give in, and the result wasn't the disaster everyone warned me about. It was clarity, a cleaner, quieter life where I didn't have to question my own choices just to make someone else comfortable. I don't hate Chloe, and I don't think I ever will. But I also don't feel responsible for fixing the consequences of her decisions. And that distinction changed everything for me. It changed how I answered calls, how I responded to pressure, how I saw myself in relation to my family, not as someone obligated to sacrifice, but as someone allowed to protect what he built. And in the end, that was the real victory. Not the condo, not the legal outcome, but the understanding that respect isn't something you negotiate after the fact. It's something you require from the beginning. If you've ever been in a situation where saying no made you feel like the villain, remember this. Protecting what you've earned doesn't make you selfish. It makes you responsible. And sometimes the hardest thing you can do is stand your ground when everyone expects you to step aside. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place.